Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? So mic's going? Okay. Welcome back from lunch. My name is Matt Mitchell. I'm at EPA Region 9 in the Water Division. And so I'll be doing the presentation today on designated uses and revising uses. And it's kind of set up into two parts. And so we'll see if we need a break between them, but I'll try to go right through. There's a disclaimer. And there we go with designated uses. I'll be addressing the fundamentals of designated uses before the use changes. And I was told not to do acronyms today, but here are a bunch. But we'll try to, some of these will be covered in the talk today. So the outline is what are designated uses? That's what, why are they important? The designated use identification. Clean Water Act sections 303C2A and 101A2. The terminology, EPA's reg requirements, rebutting the presumption of attainability. What are designated uses? Designated uses are those uses specified in the Water Quality Standards regulations for each water body or segment, whether or not they are being attained. Designated uses are aspirational, so they don't need to be limited to just what is currently attained in order to be designated. A state or authorized tribe may set designated use that it wants in the future, even if it is not currently being attained. Why are designated uses important? Designated uses are important because they establish water quality goals for a water body. In order to adequately protect your water body, you first need to know what you are protecting. The uses also help us choose the right criteria to protect the goal. And if we want to protect a water body for the purposes of swimming, for example, one of the criteria we can set is a bacterial indicator. If we want to protect aquatic life, then we might look at criteria for dissolved oxygen or temperature, for example. Getting the right criteria in place is important because criteria form the basis for other water quality tools, such as setting NPDES permit limits and creating TMDLs. So then you get the right designated use, and that's necessary to choose the right criteria and then to get the correct water quality tools in place. So here we have the three-legged stool of water quality standards again. So designated uses, the criteria that help protect designated uses, and then anti-degradation. So here's some examples of designated use categories. On the left, you have swimming, and then states often adopt for that primary contact recreation. And on the right, you have your boating, secondary contact recreation. Other examples include growth and propagation of fish, harvesting of fish for human consumption, ceremonial and cultural uses, and there are plenty of others. There are 3 points I want to make right here. First, when designating the use of a water body, EPA encourages states, authorized tribes, to carefully consider how the local community uses the water. Are there upstream or downstream impacts to the water that the community should be taking into account? Asking these types of questions can lead to better decisions for the water body. Second, there are different terminologies for designated uses. In fact, designated uses may be called beneficial uses, as they are in California, or class 1, 2, 3 type uses. The third point is that states and authorized tribes have the discretion in designating uses. They do not need to be constrained by the wording or the use categories articulated in the Clean Water Act, but they can come up with their own categories of uses. Not all states have the same designated use categories. For example, some states may say recreation, or water contact recreation, or whole body contact recreation, while others might just say class 1 recreation. Let's take a look at how different entities identify their designated uses in the next slides. So first example is Virginia, and this is actually very similar to what California does. You see they would have a use for recreation, a use for propagation and growth of a balanced indigenous population, aquatic life, wildlife, production of edible, marketable natural resources. So they're using a designational system where they can specifically designate multiple uses to each water. Or, as we'll see in the next slide, we have Vermont. This is a classification system where they're designating a class, but the class contains multiple different uses. So there is no standardized way of designating uses. Okay, that'll bring us to the first question today. So designated uses are what a state or authorized tribe sets as a goal for a water body, even if that goal has not yet been attained. True or false? True. That's right, because uses specified in the water quality standards regulations for each water body or segment, whether or not they are being attained. Second question, so Sunny State has designated Lake Adventure for fishing. Sunny State would like to protect the same water body for additional uses such as a public water supply and swimming. Can Sunny designate more than one use for Lake Adventure? Yes. Multiple uses can be designated for one water body, so yes. States and authorized tribes are required to adopt criteria that reflect current ambient conditions. Any? Here's some false. Yeah, false, because current ambient conditions are what's ever prevailing currently at that site. And the criteria to be adopted have to protect the designated use, whether or not the use is currently attained. Okay, so next we'll cover, yeah, sure.
Does that go the other way too? So if you have a use that's people are currently using the water for, do you have to designate that as a use?
Yeah, I think we'll get to another part of the presentation talks about states having to requiring states to look at their uses in triennial review. And to the extent they have existing uses that haven't been designated, they should be doing that. I'm looking for those opportunities to designate those.
There's another question over there.
Yes?
When you designate a use, do you have to designate the criteria at the same time? Or adopt criteria at the same time?
Not necessarily, but I think states and tribes tend to do both.
I can just add, with the way states will do it is if they want to split it up, they'll adopt like a use bin, but not assign it to any water first, and then later on identify the criteria. But once you want to associate a use with the water, it has to have criteria with it. Otherwise, we have no way of knowing whether you're actually protecting the use for that water.
Okay, so next we'll cover the Clean Water Act sections 303C2A and 101A2, and then some of the terminology from that. The Clean Water Act section 303C2A, water quality standards shall be established taking into consideration their use and value for public water supplies, propagation of fish and wildlife, recreational purposes, and agricultural, industrial, and other purposes, and navigation. And Clean Water Act section 101A2, this provides very direct language, a national goal, and water quality provides for protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. So this is what's commonly referred to as the fishable, swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act, or the uses specified in section 101A2 of the Act. Although people refer to these uses as fishable, swimmable, it's important to know that this is not totally an accurate depiction of the uses, and EPA has actually been trying to steer away from them, which is something actually I learned. I didn't know that. But because that's considered human-centric, fishable, swimmable, and not in line with all the objectives of the Act. So we're also talking about aquatic life, protection, propagation of fish, or an aquatic life use. This includes protection of aquatic life for human consumption, but it's more than just for humans. Recreation in and on the water. This includes recreating in the water, swimming, surfing, or other activities where immersion and ingestion are likely, as well as on the water, where boating or other activities where immersion and ingestion are less likely. Now again, and the reference to the national goal that whenever attainable, Section Clean Water Act 101A2 allows for circumstances where designated use may not be attainable in a water body, and therefore the use may be removed. We'll discuss those circumstances under which a use may be removed later in the presentation. It's also worthwhile to mention that it was Congress, not EPA, that put more prescriptive requirements on the 101A2 uses. And we'll discuss those differences when we get to the process to revise designated uses. So terminology, we have 101A2 uses that provide for protection, propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, and recreation and on the water. Subcategories of uses, of the 101A2 uses, any use that reflects the subdivision of uses specified in Clean Water Act Section 101A2 for the purpose of reducing variability. So an example would be warm water aquatic life or a limited warm water aquatic life. So you want to more accurately or better represent the desired condition for the water. Then we have non-101A2 uses. So these are uses not related to protection, propagation of fish, etc., or the recreation. These uses include those listed in Clean Water Act Section 303C2A, but not in Clean Water Act Section 101A2. So that would be public water supply, agriculture, industrial, and navigation. So we see here that the non-101A2 uses include got navigation, irrigation, and public water supply. That'll bring us to another question. So what are examples of 101A2 uses and subcategories of 101A2 uses? Check all that apply. So how about swimming? Swimming, yes, right. Limited aquatic life uses? Yes. Public water supplies? No, that's 303C2. Not. Irrigation and livestock raising? No. And then how about arsenic limited fishery? Yeah, it's a subcategory of aquatic life. Okay, EPA's regulatory requirements. The Water Quality Standards Regulation lays out EPA's expectations for states and authorized tribes when designating uses. Waste transport, waste assimilation is not an acceptable designated use of water body. Now the bold bullet points are all have to do with use revisions, so we'll talk about those more in the next segment of the talk. But just quickly, we have the subcategories: cold and warm water fisheries. The 6 factors from our regulations, we call the 13110G factors that at least one of them must be selected to justify removal of a 101A2 use. Also, when doing that, you need to adopt the highest attainable use. And the regs also establish when UAA is not required. Also specifying that states and authorized tribes may not remove designated uses if they are existing uses. or whether if the uses can be attained by technology-based effluent limits or best reasonable best management practices from non-point sources. The regulatory requirements require that states and authorized tribes must revise their standards to reflect uses that are currently attained but have not been designated. State or authorized tribes' designated uses also must consider the designated uses of downstream states or tribes' waters.
Question?
Yeah.
What about designated uses that are not existing? Is that, where does that fall?
Oh, sure. So it's a. Do you want to go ahead?
What about designated uses that are not existing? How are they? Are they any different than any other designated
Well,
use?
if they are existing, you would have to keep the use. You couldn't revise it. If they're not existing, then you have an opportunity to revise the use if you choose, or you could keep the use. Is that, yeah.
Can I clarify with you what you mean by existing, though? Do you mean essentially supported by current water quality conditions?
Yeah, I'll get into it a little bit later, but it's essentially, let's say, people use it for swimming, and it also the, whatever the criteria are being met for swimming. For both components, but be fulfilled. If they're just swimming, but they've never achieved the criteria, then it may not be considered existing. Yeah.
I think if they were attained in the past, we can't remove them. I forget what the date is.
Yeah, we'll get into 1975. Yeah, we'll get into existing uses a little more detail. Okay, next question. What is not a regulatory requirement for designated uses? A, waste transport cannot be a designated use for any water body. So that is a regulatory requirement, yeah. B, must ensure that the attainment of downstream water quality standards are protected. That's right. C, states must adopt designated uses via a class system. No, you do not have to adopt it via class system. And then D is true, states are required to conduct a public hearing when adopting designated uses. Okay, rebutting the presumption of attainability. So 101A2 uses are presumed attainable unless demonstrated otherwise through a use attainability analysis. So what does this mean? So rebutting the presumption is actually is through the UAA, and it's presumed that all waters can attain protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on the water. I want to stress the point here that presume that all waters can attain protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on the water does not mean that such uses are automatically applied. It just means that states are expected to designate these uses unless the presumption is rebutted through the UAA, in which case the state has to go through its normal process to revise the designated use. Yes?
It means that if we're gonna to replace one designated uses by, for example, if we're gonna to add new designated uses, we need to conduct UA, we need to provide UAA analysis.
Well, if it's a 101A2 use, you do not have to. Yes,
If
no.
we're gonna just take out that, we need to provide justification through the UAA.
Yeah, if you're going to take out a 101A2 use, then you do need the UAA.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Question. I guess it's also back to like essentially thinking about a UAA for shellfish for the ocean. Like, does anyone want to talk about how this momentarily may apply there? Because if we look at shellfish harvesting may occur in the ocean, but not everywhere. What would the UAA process look like for that designated use? Because it's a presumed use, right? Shellfish.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's presumed. So you would need a UAA to explain why it's not attainable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
part of our ocean
It's
triangle
something
review
that we're
plan.
going to need to scope out if we do a statewide standards action to look at it, what is a shellfish consumption type beneficial use that the state has for our ocean waters. And I think some options that we're considering is maybe doing a category of the use, one that's specific to commercial harvesting and one that could be specific to recreational harvesting or maybe tribal harvesting. So there are some options that I think we're going to be including as we scope out that project. It could be a category of the use. If it is a removal of a use because it's not happening, then yes, we'd probably be going, I assume, going through a UAA type of a project.
Yeah, I recall an example, I think it was Central Coast doing a UAA for shellfish
right.
removal. Yeah. So we have an example. Okay, another question. Recreation uses and aquatic life uses must be designated for all waters of the U.S. unless it is demonstrated that such uses are not feasible to attain. That's true, right? Yeah, unless a state or authorized tribe rebuts the presumption through the required UAA, it is presumed that all waters can attain. Let's sum up some key messages here. Designated uses are an important component of water quality standards as they drive the water quality decision making. They communicate a state or authorized tribe's desired conditions for its waters, whether or not that condition is currently attained. 101A2 uses, or the uses that provide for protection, propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water, are presumed attainable and must be designated unless a state or authorized tribe demonstrates otherwise through the required UAA. When adopting uses, states and authorized tribes must take into consideration the use and value of non-101A2 uses, such as public water supply, industrial, agricultural, navigation, and other uses, in addition to the 101A2 uses. Okay, is there any other questions on that segment? Yes? Oh, can you use the microphone, please?
Thanks. So I was trying to think of examples. So where you wouldn't, or where you might not designate the 101A2 or de-designate those be examples. So the examples I can think of are ones where you have like a hot spring, for example, or wildlife can't exist in it, or it's very naturally high in mineral content that might kill everything. Is there good examples or a list of examples of when you might
when you
not,
have a 101A2
yeah,
designated use and you've decided you want to, well, probably anytime you're a subcategory that's less stringent.
Well, so you have
uses criteria that's less stringent.
Well, I was thinking of examples. These things automatically apply to water. So when would you not want to apply it to a certain water? I've seen ones for, like, example, Royal Mountain King Mine, where they removed some of the municipal use because it's so high in a certain like arsenic.
I'm trying to think of.
So when would you want to not? So those are kind of automatic, if I understand. You're supposed to have those unless they can't attain that. So is there a list of reasons or types of water that wouldn't attain that and should not be?
Well, there's the 13110G factors that
what you go through.
define what's, when it's not feasible to attain. So I'm going to get into those later. Is that sort of what?
That might be what I'm
Yeah,
thinking
I mean, and another example, I think there was Sulphur Creek, Central Valley region I think it was a UAA for high levels of background mercury. So I believe that was either a site-specific objective or a UAA, but I'd have to look into that.
So when you do the UAA, then are you removing a specific, like if you're talking about mercury? I thought my understanding of the UAA, you'd remove the beneficial use altogether.
That's right.
Okay, so not just specific to a certain type of contaminant. It would be the entire use.
Well, you could define it as like a limited mercury use, and we'll get into examples like that. So there are states who have done things like, did it for a specific contaminant.
Right, if I could just add, just to make sure that when we're entering into this next one, you have you're sort of in the right starting place. So the way the regulations are written is that you can remove a designated use and then, Matt will talk about sort of the 6 reasons why you might remove a designated use. But the requirements also say you have to adopt the highest attainable use. So there's a variety of ways of saying that. So one thing that we have been sort of recommending to states is, let's say that one of the 6 reasons that, or you're able to cite one of the 6 reasons for why you can't attain a particular use, it really is dependent upon the ability to attain one criteria for one parameter. So in that situation, if that water can really attain the criteria for all the other parameters, our general recommendation is, if the whole idea is to restore a water to its Clean Water Act objectives, you don't necessarily want to say, oh, well, the water can't meet its mercury criteria, and so we're going to now downgrade and adopt less stringent criteria for all the parameters. So a strategy is saying it's just mercury limited. So what that means is the designated use you've adopted as your highest attainable use is a use that carries with it criteria that were the same all the other times, except for the criteria that really was the one you couldn't achieve. So that's why you're hearing things like mercury limited or arsenic limited. It isn't necessarily required, but the requirement is to reflect the highest attainable. Like, what is the best use that water can attain despite the factor that you're citing to? So some of the factors that Matt will go through are naturally occurring conditions or dams and diversions and things like that. So that'll make a little bit more sense as he goes through the next session.
Hey, speaking of which, I think we're on to the next session. Yes?
A general question on removing a designated use. Designated uses that are not existing may be removed if they meet those feasibility criteria. Generally speaking, are there a lot of waters where uses are just are not existing but are potential, or do you have an idea of how representative the subset of waters are that we're looking at that the uses are solely in the future? A lot of times when there's this idea or the desire to remove a use or limit the use, oftentimes it's an existing use, and of course this is not an available route.
Yeah, well, I think of some non-101A2 uses that fit that sort of. In California, the regulation where public water supply had to be designated for all waters. So there, yeah, we're getting a lot of situations where regions are coming back and saying, wait, we don't want public water supply for most of these. Are constructed ag drains. We don't use them for drinking water. We never plan to use them. So that's a situation where they're looking into, where they're saying it's not existing, will never be attained. Can we please? Is there a way to revise these? And that's the one thing that comes to mind. As far as 101A2 uses, I think it comes up a little bit less in that context, but I don't know, anybody think of examples?
No, I mean, you'd be surprised at the number of situations of where the use that's designated isn't actually the existing use. And a lot of that is because we came out a few years ago with, guidance that talked about how your existing use doesn't have to be.
I'm going to give you your own.
Oh gosh, okay. Where the existing use doesn't have to be labeled as the same as the designated use, so it can be more precise. So for example, and I think, again, Matt will go through this a little bit, but let's say the water is currently designated as a recreational use. But let's say people have been swimming in it, but the criteria, because of, agricultural lands or whatever, the criteria never satisfy the bacteria criteria. So the existing use there is not primary contact recreation. The existing use there is people swimming in dirty water. And so you don't have an existing use problem. So it has, over the years, we have found that existing uses it doesn't always serve as a barrier. What we really want people to do is reflect really what is the highest attainable use. And it's really about just being precise on how you describe the existing use. But it does probably depend on the region that you're in.
Yeah, particularly with regard to the sort of recent-ish change to the rule where existing use was defined in the disjunctive. that the water quality has been attained since 1975 and the use actually occurred, where I think formally the practice was, or it used to be, I'm sorry, it used to be in the disjunctive, and now it's in the conjunctive, where both of those elements have to be present for use to be deemed existing.
Right, so to be clear, that was never by rule. So it was an interpretation that we had made back in the 80s, and the reason for that interpretation was because at the time, we thought, I'll say we, even though I was like 10, but we thought that, that the way you described your existing use had to be the same as your designated use. So it was like it was an all or nothing situation. So in that situation, we weren't gonna sit there and say that, you know, you had to have both before you could protect recreation altogether. As we evolved, we realized that there's no reason why they have to be the same. So when we looked at the definition, regulatory definition of existing uses to be use that had actually been attained, or I think it's just actually attained, we realized that the interpretation really is actually as if the use occurred, attained as if the water quality occurred. And we were clear in our preamble, as well as some of the follow-on guidance, that that's when you know you have an existing use. There is some discretion afforded to
do you mean in that case it's naturally ephemeral, it's naturally intermittent, it's naturally low flow, or are those thought of just together, or can you have, because a stream could be made to be ephemeral?
Right.
Yeah.
don't believe-
This is going to be a lesson in punctuation.
Yeah.
If you could, can you move it back? Sorry, the slide back.
Oh, yeah,
Can you
yeah,
move the
sure.
slide back so they can see the words? So there you go. So the way we are interpreting it now, which has not yet been tested, so keep in mind I can tell you this, and then if we test it and we get sued, and then it was a really bad idea. But since I didn't write it, so the way we're looking at it and the way we've talked to our attorneys about it is that it's the flow conditions or water levels are the common words. So it's natural flow conditions or water levels, ephemeral flow conditions or water levels, intermittent flow conditions or water levels, or low flow conditions or water levels. So natural doesn't describe all of them. So it's natural, ephemeral, intermittent, or low. Those are your 4 conditions of flow levels, of flow conditions and water levels.
So that would be low flow levels caused by other than natural conditions, is that correct?
Yes, that would be the way that you would interpret it, yes. Like I said, it has not been tested yet. But, so for example, I will give you an example. So some states have used the concept of low flow conditions to be a reason to remove primary contact recreation. That one gets a little tricky because of children's recreation, but we'll put that aside for a moment. But in those situations, we would not expect the state to explain, to demonstrate that it was low because of natural reasons. It doesn't matter. It's just, they have to just prove that that the depth of the water is actually precluding the attainment. So one thing to keep in mind is that for all of these factors, you can't just say this factor exists. You have to actually, your demonstration is showing that that factor is actually precluding the use from occurring. So just because something is a low water flow or a low depth doesn't automatically mean that recreation can't be there. So anyway, that's an example of where, we would say someone might say low water levels preclude recreation uses, and we wouldn't say, okay, prove that they're low because of natural reasons.
So if they're low because of factors that we could control, such as diversions for water use, that would be considered a factor, even though it's a factor we can control, we can still.
Well, it does have the rest of it that says unless these conditions may be compensated for by the discharge of sufficient volume of effluent discharges without violating blah, 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 blah. I haven't really thought about how that applies in the situation of a water diversion, but I think one could argue that if there is a way to manage that flow such that you could actually attain the use, that it would be harder to demonstrate this factor applies.
Okay, factor 3, human-caused conditions or sources of pollution prevent the attainment of the use and cannot be remedied or would cause more environmental damage to correct than to leave in place. Factor 3 can be used for legacy pollutants like PCBs, where dredging the water to remove PCBs could actually stir them up and may cause more environmental damage than if they just left the PCBs there.
What do you mean by conditions?
Condition of the water body?
I'm just wondering if that gets into things like channelization and concrete line channels and.
Yeah, I think it could.
Okay.
Sorry, and I know this really stinks. You guys, your necks are craning, but things like hydrologic modifications and things like that, that's actually going to be factor
4. Yeah.
4.
Yeah.
But this is one of those factors that's probably the washiest of all of our factors, because human-caused conditions is sort of in the eye of the beholder. And I probably should just leave it at that. But I think if you're really specifically talking about like channelization and things like that, there is a specific factor related to that. Yeah.
That factor, thank you. That factor usually, it's a temporary one, right? Human factor, it's a, for example, it's a construction. It can be considered a human factor, and usually it's a temporary one. In case if a temporary changing that condition should be used based on that, it's doing some changes in designated use.
I mean, it could be, but not necessarily. I mean, human-caused conditions could be anything from, we've seen it for mercury air deposition. That's probably the most common one that we've got right now. We've got the, as Matt mentioned, the legacy pollutants of PCBs that are in your water. That's a human cause. So those aren't temporary. Those are pretty darn permanent. But it could, I mean, maybe, like I said, it's in the eye of the beholder. Where this is probably the one place where people are finding that they can interpret human-caused conditions pretty broadly, and the agency doesn't have any guidance on what a human-caused condition really is.
It cannot be remedied, correct? So-
Right, and
so
right, and
that-
the part to right, the key that thanks, Matt. That the key is that it cannot be remedied or would cause more environmental damage to correct. So it's not just any human-caused condition.
That would just imply that it's a little more than a temporary, like construction or it's something more, usually something more long-term. Yeah.
That was your question? Awesome.
Okay. Factor 4, dams, diversions, or other types of hydrologic modifications preclude the attainment of the use and is not feasible to restore the water body to its original condition or to operate such modification in a way that would result in the attainment of the use. And I think, again, that shellfish example that we used, I think used that factor, that there was such hydrologic modification in the stream or the river that there was no existing shellfish use and and something that they felt couldn't be attained. So, yeah.
Has there been any conversation or any legal argument over the term "not feasible to restore"? I think some people would argue that there are certain, there's concrete line channels that you can restore.
Yeah.
Has that been a topic of discussion or?
I have not heard that come up. Original condition, not feasible to restore.
It may be. You may end up talking about it more on a specific project in the future.
I'm thinking of Central Valley where they generally use, they'll say I've not heard an argument where they've said it's feasible to restore many of those water bodies to, another example though here is the LA region where many rivers and streams that have been straightened or concrete lined to move floodwaters from the urban areas to the ocean. And California has shown that in some of these instances, the modifications precluded attainment of the designated recreational use. And that's actually, we're going to get into that as one of the case studies. Factor 5 is physical conditions related to natural features of the water body, such.
It can wait.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just say that quickly. Factor 5 is about natural conditions, pertains to aquatic life uses, and speaks to the natural physical factors of the stream that preclude the attainment of the use. So, for example, here the tree cover is leading to poor light and heat penetration and may preclude attainment of the aquatic life use. And factor 6 is actually one of the more common rationales we get for doing UAAs or variances. Factor 6 says that substantial and widespread economic and social impact is what's makes it not feasible to meet the use. If the only way for a water to meet its applicable criterion would be, for example, if all the dischargers installed a particular treatment technology that could achieve their water quality-based limits, but doing so would cause a substantial impact on the dischargers and the effect would be widespread in the community, then factor 6 would be the rationale of the UAA. And on Thursday, I believe we'll have there'll be a whole module on this factor under the title of economics.
I kind of have
Any? Yeah, perfect time.
Well, I had a question about these in general. So if you really only need to not meet one of these, when you do a UAA, can you just look at one? Do you really need to look at all 6?
Now,
Because if
you
you
can choose one, but often regions choose multiple ones
Okay.
because they have a case under, but they only need one.
Right, the requirement is that you have to prove one. I think it probably should be ors in between. States will often try and make multiple ones, but we generally will only cite to whichever ones we think were fully demonstrated. Like, so 2 halves don't make a whole UAA kind of a thing.
Missy?
I was just curious if there's any that are more or less difficult to meet the exception, I guess. Is there some that are a little bit easier to demonstrate, or ones that you would say are more difficult?
It's case specific. I mean, I think factor 6 is, my way of thinking, is difficult.
Yeah,
to meet.
that's what I was.
mean, you have to go through quite a analysis to show that. But I could see where others are also can be difficult at times.
I mean, I think if you were really going to ask us to pick, I mean, I think Matt's right. For a use change scenario, factor 6 tends to be harder because you're looking at costs across all the pollutant sources. The only real place where I've seen factor 6 really likely to work is in a CSO scenario where the majority, the main source of the pollutant is the CSO discharges.
What is CSO? Sorry.
Combined sewer overflows.
Okay.
I forget where I am.
Yeah.
You guys don't really usually have that problem. So it's more of a problem sort of east of the Mississippi. Factor 1 tends to be hard. It's hard to show if something is natural. I think that one of the questions sort of implied that.
Yeah, I feel like, I guess why I'm asking is because I feel like 4 would be probably relatively easy compared to some of the other ones, but I don't know the level of, I guess we're going to get into that maybe in the next.
Where does pop up a little more frequently than I've seen, so
okay.
yeah, that might be right.
Easier to demonstrate anyways.
Yeah.
I think, Matt, you've got a couple more questions.
Oh, sure.
While I look at these, I keep thinking that something keeps ringing in my head, like maximum benefit to the people. So in each one of these, I'm thinking that maybe the maximum benefit to the people is being considered, and that may be the crux of use attainment analysis.
I think that's California law, maybe? That's Porter Cologne. It sounds familiar, right? So is that for I know for anti-degradation, that's, I think, one of the California factors, and it sounds related. You know, I think we were talking earlier, there was probably Porter Cologne preceded the Clean Water Act, and sometimes there's, you know, a little bit of crossover, but not exactly the same, but yeah, maybe from the California specific talks is possible. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of these seem to involve sort of like proving a negative to some extent. You know, if it's not feasible to restore the dam, or, you know, something, it's unattainable to change something. And I was wondering if there's anything out there that you look to, any court cases or guidance or anything about how to go about doing something like that.
Anjali?
I didn't jump in. No, I think it was probably constructed purposefully. I think the way the Clean Water Act sort of was set up is that the burden of proof to say that you're not going to meet the objectives of the Clean Water Act is then placed on demonstrating that you can't attain something. We don't really have any, you know, aside from Factor 6 on the econ, which Gary will present on later in the week, you know, we don't really have any guidance on them. And, you know, that can be a good or a bad thing. You know, I mean, if you think about it, if we were really, really prescriptive on how you do it, that limits the amount of flexibility that states have to make a compelling case. So, you know, we generally like to say that we were intentionally vague in several instances to allow states to provide, you know, put the best foot forward and run it through a public process to see what kind of case can be made. But you're right, it is really, I mean, I don't know that I'd say you're proving the negative, but you have to prove that you can't, I guess that is kind of the negative, but yeah, it's just sort of the way the act was set up.
Yes.
I don't know if this is another kind of grammar police type question, but with respect to factor 6, you have to demonstrate that it would result in substantial, widespread economic and social impact. So both of those have to be demonstrated for that factor.
Yeah, there's a guidance document that kind of runs through how you can make a showing of each of those.
I think I understand the economic component. Could you give an example of a social impact?
So yeah, try to think. So the economic, Gary?
So I think the intention of that is that the economic impact is is it affordable? Is whatever pollution control that's necessary to meet the standard affordable? And then the social part is, okay, well, where does that affordability spread around? And so it's not just good enough. So for example, in a simple case, there's a facility that needs to meet an effluent limit that's based on a water quality standard, and it can't afford the pollution controls that are necessary to do that, and it would go out of business. And so that would be the substantial part. That's a substantial impact. It would go out of business. But the question then becomes, well, that's not alone good enough. That impact needs to be widespread throughout the community. It's not just this one facility is going to go out of business. Is what is the impact of the wider community on that facility going out of business? So the idea is that the community, that water body belongs to the community as a whole, not just some entity. So the idea behind the both substantial and widespread is that it's not just an economic impact per se, but that impact affects the greater community.
They're getting the microphone.
So in that instance, for them to implement the more stringent requirements, if to stay in business, the cost was then passed along to, for example, the people in the community, and the cost would be pretty extreme and have a significant impact on the whole community, and it wouldn't be socially feasible, then that wouldn't be an objective or use that they would want to continue through with, want to attain, right?
They would.
Because it would cause a widespread effect, negative on the community.
Right, they could revise that use or remove that use to avoid the cost, right, to the community. Yeah. Any other questions on that?
So in thinking about climate change impacts, I think that we're going to have potentially some changes in beneficial uses to some water bodies. Do you think that would fit under number 3, or is there like some way, have you guys thought about how we're going to deal with that?
It's an excellent question. No, we haven't figured it out, aside from trying to, and I don't know, did we keep the climate change module in this academy? I don't think we did, right? So what we've been trying to do is trying to work with states to build in resilience in standards up front to be able to handle the climate change. We really have no idea, because I don't know that any person would say that, it's a human caused condition, but to that extent, then all water quality will be lost at that point. So I think that's why the focus really needs to be on building the resilience up front, to make sure that if you're anticipating certain types of climate change, that the waters can handle some of that. It's going to be a combination of designating the right uses, proper planning, anti-degradation, community buy-in to be able to do that. If we ever get to the place where we're having to change uses because of climate change, I think we're going to be in trouble.
And was that part of your question, that they would actually have to change the uses due to, yeah, because they no longer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a question on Yeah, it's a question on everyone's minds. It's a slippery slope, because the moment we open up one of these factors for generically climate change, it's going to be really hard to shut that door. And I personally sort of fear for that moment, which is why I will not answer that question in any way at all, and encourage everyone to try and find ways to sort of use this opportunity now to find ways to help our waters be more resilient up front.
Would there be a problem there with it being possibly have an existing use, though, because of, I mean, if it's something that climate change caused, it would be something that was achievable since in the last 40 years, but now is changed, so would that potentially be a problem?
Well, I mean, I think there's a technical standpoint about removing uses and things like that. You're absolutely right. If it's an existing use, you're not going to be able to remove the use at all. But if you step back and you think about actually protecting the waters and make sure the waters are actually protected, so you put aside sort of the existing use thing and everything else, is that the only way to really make sure that these waters are ever going to be able to meet their designated use is going to have to be building up protections up front. Because even now, we run, and no one actually asked this question, which I was surprised, but because we usually get this question, is what happens if there's an existing use that's not attainable anymore? And the reality is that water will forever be on the impaired waters list. Like, you cannot remove that use. So, I've been in the program for a long time, and I've been through times people have said, well, let's just get rid of the existing use provision. Like, what's the point if it's just keeping unattainable uses on the books? And my response is, because the whole point of that is to force planning, like proactive planning. You get rid of that and you lose all that proactive planning, because you don't want people who've already screwed everything up to have to suffer the consequences. So, I think it's sort of the same thing, is that at this point we just need to be in the proactive sense so that we never get to the place where we're going to have all these waters designated for uses that just can't attain them. We got philosophical very quickly there, but it was a really good question.
Anything else before we move on to highest attainable use? Okay. So once the use is deemed unattainable, the regs require that the highest attainable use be adopted. Highest attainable use helps to strive to restore and maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the waters. But this is only required for 101A2 uses. The highest attainable use is the best you can do that is still attainable. Highest attainable use is the attainable use that results from the process of determining what is not attainable. An example here is that a state or authorized tribe demonstrates that a use cannot be attained due to natural background of selenium concentrations. The state or authorized tribe then determines that the highest attainable use is considering the best use that can be attained despite the impact of natural background selenium concentrations. So one option would be to describe this highest attainable use as a selenium-limited aquatic life use. Highest attainable use is the modified aquatic life or recreation use. The example is that state or authorized tribe demonstrates through a UAA that the warm water aquatic life use is not attainable. The highest attainable use would be a modified version of the warm water aquatic life use that is attainable and closest to the 101A2 uses, such as a limited warm water aquatic life use. Okay, next the question on highest attainable use. Is it A, the currently attained designated use, B, the use closest to the 101A2 uses and attainable, C, the best criteria for each parameter that can be attained, or D, no such thing? B? Yeah, B, the use closest to the 101A2 use and is attainable. Yeah.
So when you talk about attainable, is there a time frame that you use in which it can be attained?
There's no strict timeline. 'Cause if it's, I mean,
is it 100 years, or, 30
Yeah.
years?
I would say that often it's that there's it doesn't reach the point where you're saying it's 100. If it's 100 years, there'd be a question of whether that can be actually, if that's really attainable. Sometimes I know TMDLs are written for very long time frames, so it's a possibility. But generally, it's not something that is time limited. It would be site specific. Each case you'd have to consider, and that if it is attainable.
It really depends on the information that you've got. So, it's intended to mean, is it ultimately attainable? Is there anything that you could do to ultimately attain that use? And, I can understand the confusion around it, but we have, and what we'll learn about later in the week, is something called variances, where if you believe that there is any chance that you could actually attain the use, then variances are a good first stop, because what it basically allows you to do is identify what you can attain over a period of time and work towards it before you give up on it altogether. So it's a good bridge. So for example, if you know it can't be attained in the next 10 years, but maybe in 15, maybe in 20, you don't really know, that's not really a good candidate for a use change. You don't want to change your use in that situation. And so that's why we built the variances regulations into 2015 to sort of give that time for things to kind of play out, for dischargers and states to try out things before moving the use altogether.
I tend to think that if it can be achieved, for my children or my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren, then it shouldn't be removed. But, I don't know if that thinking is like, oh, can I really apply that? So I appreciate your answer.
Okay, so question here. States and authorized tribes are required to adopt the HAU when removing or revising any designated use. True or false? I hear one false. Anybody else? Yeah, it's false, because only for 101A2 uses. Yeah. And then the UAA process informs the HAU. Yes, that's true. Right. Any questions on highest attainable uses or anything else? Okay, on to how to remove a non-101A2 use, the use and value demonstration. Okay, non-101A2 uses. As mentioned earlier, there are other circumstances where the UAAs are not required, and removing a non-101A2 use is one of them. UAAs, and consequently the highest attainable uses demonstration, are not required. Instead, a use and value demonstration is required. As I said before, a state or a tribe can choose to do a UAA to satisfy the requirement, but it's not required. The use and value demonstration, examples of what to consider in it is relevant descriptive information, attainability information, value and or benefits associated with either retaining or removing the use, impacts of the use removal on other designated uses. And the example for this one is a water body like in California where the state has generically designated the public drinking water supply use as part of a statewide action. The state or tribe decides there is no use or value in retaining such a use for that water body. The state or tribe could provide the public and EPA with documentation that the public water supply is not an existing use. Example, there is no evidence that the water body was used for the purpose, and the water quality does not support this use. The nearby population uses an alternative drinking water supply, and projected population trends suggest that current supply is sufficient to accommodate growth. So it's a little bit of a simpler analysis than the usual UAA.
Can you clarify what is a non-101A2 use? I'm looking at slide 62, the one before.
Okay.
Which says, the use and value of water for public water supplies, propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, recreation, and ag, industrial, and other purposes. But then a 101A2 use talks about protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife. So what is the difference?
Yeah, it gets all the way back to the 303C2A of the Clean Water Act, is more inclusive, and it kind of includes all those. It includes what we see here: the public water supplies, propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, recreation, and the agriculture, industrial. So it's all inclusive, and that's where the language of use and value is used in that part of the statute. So when you're talking the non-101A2 uses, don't have the requirements that the 101A2 have, which is more prescriptive. So you have to consider use and value by the terms of that part of the statute, but they do not have to do what for what you'd have to do to remove an aquatic life use or recreational use. So it's a little less prescriptive, but whereas the aquatic life and recreation would you'd have to consider use and value, and then all the other things that are in 101A2.
Yeah, I think the confusion is the construction of the slide, right?
Yeah.
So use and value is for the things that are not, fishable, swimmable.
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, I think technically speaking, if I was channeling my lawyer, she would say that the taking into consideration the use and value is actually for all of those uses. It's just that when Congress added the bar that that wherever attainable, the protection, propagation, blah, 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 has to be attained, they kind of put that step ahead, and that essentially satisfies the taking into consideration. So what's left basically is that for any use that's not a 101A2 use or subcategory is left with, you have to take in consideration the use and value. Does that make sense? Okay. It is complicated. We've actually played around with different ways of trying to explain this. So if any of our 5 explanations worked for you, just write it down on your evaluation so we know which one to go with.
The 2015 reg revisions do a good job of kind of explaining that distinction and what states and tribes should do as a result of that distinction. Right?
So use and value is all inclusive for everything, and then UAA is just specific for.
That,
so use.
Yeah.
Okay, so use and value is all inclusive for all the designated uses, whereas the UAA is just specifically for fish and shellfish and wildlife and recreation.
Correct.
That is correct, but you don't have to do both for the 101A2 uses.
Yes. Okay.
UAA takes care of the other requirement. Yeah. Okay, so when can uses not be removed? One, they are existing uses, unless it's a use requiring more stringent criteria is added. Or 2, such uses will be attained by implementing technology-based effluent limits, essentially, and by implementing cost-effective and reasonable best management practices for non-point source control. So basically, if it's existing use, you can't remove it. If it's technology-based limits, which are also in the Act, that are kind of baseline requirements for certain industries, if you can project that will achieve the use, or if reasonable best management practices can be used to it, and you can see that attains the use. That's another reason for not being able to remove the use. Okay, existing uses. What are the existing uses? Okay, these are uses attained in a water body on or after, as we talked about, 1975, November 28th, 1975, whether or not they are included in the water quality standards. Existing uses serve as a baseline or floor of water quality below which we don't want to drop.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody made a statement earlier about if you're not meeting the criteria, but the use is happening, that the use is not existing. In the example was swimming, and that if you have people swimming in the water, but the bacteria levels were high, that wouldn't be considered an existing use.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I believe that's the current interpretation.
Well, in reality, what you should be asking yourself is what is the existing use, not what is not the existing use. So what Matt's about to go through is sort of how you figure it out, and it's based on the data that you have available to you. So if the data you have available to you says that since 1975, people have been swimming in water that has had E. coli criteria of 1,000, then that's your existing use, is people swimming in water with E. coli of 1,000 CFUs, So it isn't really about whether primary contact rec is or isn't. So, that's the way you would use the data. If the data said that it's people swimming and they've been in, what is the number, like 126 now for E. coli, then you know that if that's the use that's occurring and that's the criteria level that's been attained and the data shows that, then you know for sure primary contact rec would be an existing use. Does that help clarify it a little?
A little bit. You're still going with the 1975 date, though, correct?
Yes, because that is the regulatory definition of existing uses.
Yeah.
So Stacy Gillespie, once she returns, may have a little bit more to say to illuminate this for us for California. But for beneficial uses in California, we use the same November date. And we consider an existing use to be a use actually attained in the water body on or after that November date, whether or not they are actually designated in any of our basin plans. So if we have evidence that the use is existing, that it can be attained, that it has been attained since that date, we consider it an existing use.
And that is consistent with this.
Okay. Oh, and Stacy's there, and I just got a thumbs up, so I must not have messed that up too much.
Means that the existing use it's the same as a baseline use, the use which we have baseline before any activities.
Well, baseline can be a hard word because where do you set your baseline? And it could be that things have gotten better since the 1970s, or they've gotten worse since then. So I guess it's kind of how you think about baseline.
Is it possible that it's we do not have existing use? Only designated use, because we didn't have any data before 9.
So in California, we can consider those probable uses, but not existing, and they could still be designated.
Just to add to that, we should keep in mind that when we refer to the term baseline water quality, we use that term in our state's anti-DEG policy. And so when and if the anti-DEG policy is triggered, what we are looking at there is the best water quality that was achieved since 1968, which would have been when Porter Cologne was established as compared to the 1975 Clean Water Act amendments.
Yes. So this may be just too far down the rabbit hole, but let's say there are people swimming in the dirty water, but they don't get the bad bacteria levels, like they've been swimming in it April and May and June, and then July is when the water gets really nasty. But is there sort of a temporal aspect to water quality standards?
There could be.
They could be. I mean, I think it would be kind of up to the states. I don't know, I mean, how many people here work with Deb Smith? Okay, well, I mean, when she was here. So she actually, she worked really closely with us when we were writing our preamble to the proposed rule and to the final rule. And she actually influenced a lot of what we wrote because she wanted to make sure that the states had, let me rephrase. She wanted to make sure that we were very clear at the discretion that was afforded to states when there wasn't conclusive data or when just data wasn't available. So a lot of our existing use language sort of stemmed from a letter that we had written to the state of Oklahoma, but when we wrote our proposed rule, we wrote it a little too black and whitish, and we failed to reflect the discretion that had always been intended. And so in your situation that you're talking about temporarily or anything like that, that's a situation where the state can use its discretion based on the data that it has available. If it knows it's only got data available for April and May, and yet knows that there's really good reason to know that in July the numbers tend to be really high or the opposite, that's all information that can be taken into account. The only thing that the agency cannot endorse is a state that has information and data and chooses to ignore it and make a different decision. So for example, if you had data indicating that the water quality was never actually achieved, we can't support a decision for the state to say that is actually an existing use. Now, I will say that one of the main reasons why we went through this process to clarify what an existing use is we're trying to shift people away from believing that the driver in the in the standards program is existing uses. It is not the driver. It is just intended to identify a floor so that the real conversation happens around what the highest attainable use is. So I think, Rebecca, you made the point. Is just because something's not an existing use does not mean that that should not absolutely be a designated use. All your water quality programs, all your controls, everything else is based on criteria, which is based on the designated use, not the existing use. So we're sort of 10, 15 years on this road of trying to trying to shift people from worrying so much about what the existing use is and worrying that if something's not declared an existing use, then all is lost. And trying to tell people that the purpose of existing uses is to make sure we're not screwing up stuff that we already achieved and really focusing about what's really attainable in the future. And if from this uses module, if you don't get anything else, just try and get that the real power of designating uses is really the highest attainable use, not existing uses.
How are we doing on time? Are we past?
We're ahead of schedule, but if
Okay.
you want to end at 2:30, then we'll be back.
Okay. I'll go through fairly quickly, I think, at this point. I think we kind of covered kind of the data, looking at data for existing uses on those questions. So do we have a question in there? No? Oh. Okay. Difference between existing uses and designated uses. So designated uses focus on the attainable goal condition that may not yet be attained. Existing uses focus on the past or present conditions that are actually attained. Again, designated uses are for future, sometimes future and forward-reaching aspirational goals. Okay, another question. Both designated uses and existing uses can be removed by citing at least one of the 6 factors in section 131.10G. Oh, did I hear a false? Anybody? Yeah, it's false because you can't remove an existing use. If it just said designated uses can be removed by citing the 131.10G factors, it would be true. Okay, I'll take questions at the end. I'll just go through this example. I kind of cited this before, so I'll go through pretty quickly. It's the LA region high flow conditions UAA. The LA region has many rivers and streams that have been straightened and concrete lined to move large quantities of stormwater from urban areas to the ocean. And so there are times when the water levels rise rapidly, making it very dangerous for any recreators. and often actually needing swift water rescues. And it happens at the level of bacteria in the channelized waters during these times exceed criteria just during and just following these rain events. So the LA Regional Water Board adopted a temporal change to the recreational uses that was only in effect during and just after storm events of a specified size. They provided data and information on the level of rainfall that triggered swift water rescues and information on how long the conditions lasted. They used factor 2 and factor 4, the 130, 110G requirements. Factor 2, intermittent flow and water levels prevent the attainment of the use. And factor 4, hydrologic modifications, in this case concrete line channels, precluded attainment of the use, and EPA approved these revisions. To sum up the key messages for UAAs. Use revisions can reflect more accurate depictions of uses for a water body and allow for a clearer articulation of the attainable use with more effective criteria. State and authorized tribes may not remove designated use if, 1, they are existing uses, or 2, such uses will be attained by technology-based limits or reasonable best management practices for non-point source control. To revise or remove a designated use, if it's a 101A2 use, submit the use change to EPA for action along with the UAA as supporting documentation. UAA has to point to at least one of the 6 130-110G factors. That a new use must be the highest attainable use. Designated uses that are existing uses cannot be removed. Then for the non-101A2 use, you submit the use change to EPA along with the use and value demonstration. Again, designated uses that are existing uses cannot be removed. And of course, early coordination between the state or tribes and EPA is always a good idea. Okay, I think I'm going to actually skip the review questions because they're repetitive, but if you want to take a look at them and if you have any questions about them, feel free. And I'll take questions for any last questions. Okay, hello, Jesse.
I was just curious, the example that you gave in LA, how long did it take for that UAA to, that seems like a pretty straightforward one, but how long was that process?
I think it was a fairly long process. I think, Terry, did you work on that?
It was actually fairly quick because it was such a cut and dry case. I mean, the length of time was primarily the time to go through the state, the regional board and the state process. But I think we were approved within our 30-day.
How long the state and regional board process was?
I think it was about a year, max.
Does anybody from Region 4 have any other thoughts on that? No?
It used to be.
Well, back there, yeah.
On that example you gave,
I'm having trouble hearing, yeah.
On the LA example you gave, was that an existing use?
No, I mean, I assume we determined it was not existing use, otherwise we couldn't have approved.
Okay, so you, so I know you said before that you cannot remove if it's an existing use, but can you revise if it's existing use?
No.
So back on the LA one, I'm going to go somewhat out on a limb. I wasn't completely involved in the project at the time. I was just hearing about it kind of tangentially. But I think that they actually spent quite a bit of time putting some cameras up in those channels to see if there was actually any use happening there. So they did, I'm sure it was more than just a year worth of time doing some of the legwork that needed to be done to make sure that the use wasn't happening.
And to add to that as well, I think in the basin plan, the use is actually designated as existing. And so one thing to keep in mind, and I'm going out on a limb a little bit too because I was not involved, but one thing to keep in mind that our basin planning function of articulating or identify what a use is it a probable future use? Is it a existing use? That determination doesn't necessarily make it so. if there are facts and evidence that amply demonstrate a use actually isn't existing. When one takes a closer look at it, and when you have a situation, you've got a temporal component of high or low flow, low in the summer and high in the winter. The thinking is that was never attainable. So maybe aspects outside of those windows were existing as of 1975, but the high and low flows never were. So they were able to parse that out with the high and low flow suspension of the Rec 1 use. So it wasn't the removal of Rec 1 altogether, just during those time components.
Zane, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I had a question on the 101A2, just a clarification on what is and isn't. So one of the ones that's, I believe the 101A2 is the fishing, but there's a definition that was recently put in place for subsistence fishing and tribal subsistence fishing. And so those are more stringent components of that. So if somebody adopted that, is that considered a 101A2 use as well? But it's more stringent than that. And would that take then, if it was designated, a use attainability analysis to remove that?
Sounds like that's a revision of the 101A2 use for a more, and so that would, that wouldn't have required a UAA when they did it, but you're saying, so if you have it and then you want to go take it away?
Yes.
I think it would qualify, so, because it's yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so a part of the 101A2 uses is also being able to safely consume the fish. So consumption of fish is also a 101A2 use, even though it doesn't explicitly say that. So it's fish, shellfish, and wildlife, but fish, happy, healthy fish, but also eatable fish. So on the subsistence fishing, that would be a 101A2 use because that's really about the safe consumption of fish at subsistence levels for tribal communities.
Thanks. And does that take, you mentioned about designating them, then in order to designate that to an area, since we've adopted these definitions, what, on the federal level, what does it take in order to, is it take any type of a analysis in order to designate an area?
Not in that particular case, you would just send us the justification or the reasons for establishing the use. And
so you can establish it much easier than removing it.
that's right.
Okay, just
especially
clarifying
for the 101A2 uses, there's no UA. The law specifically says no UAA is necessary for that.
And then the other thing about the existing use on that, so there was some discussion about people who are subsistence fishing in areas, but the areas are very high in mercury. So the activity is taking place, but the whether or not that's really, the use is really there, the beneficial use actually exists because although people are doing it, it's still not healthy for them. So is it because people are doing it, does it exist, or because the mercury levels are already so high, it doesn't exist?
Yeah, one interpretation is it's not an existing use, but it sounds like it's it's something that's aspirational, right? You want to get there.
So there was a discussion of that, whether or not it actually exists because people are doing it, even if it's, I think it's the same with the bacteria. You're swimming in nasty waters, it exists or not exist.
But do they want to designate it?
In certain areas, certain people want it definitely designated.
So to me, it would be something you'd want. It may or may not be existing. Sounds like it's not. By certain definition, it depends on the interpretation, but really what you're wanting to is to improve the water body to get to the actual designated use.
So this is where my comment about how your existing use and your highest attainable use, they play different roles. So in the scenario you're talking about, it may not be an existing use, but once it's been designated, the question is really about whether it's attainable or not. So just because they've got high levels of mercury and it's not an existing use doesn't mean then, and I'm not suggesting you were implying this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be giving up on that subsistence fishing use. It just means the evaluation needs to be about whether or not there's anything that can be done to reduce the mercury levels so that the safe subsistence fishing can actually occur. If there was a way to demonstrate that there's nothing that can be done to achieve the levels, then you're talking about removing the use, and then you're talking about whether you're removing the use for all the pollutants or for some of the pollutants or just for mercury, but the existing use would be the floor, whatever that really is.
There's some discussion about whether or not, people are doing subsistence fishing, so they could do a survey to see where people are subsistence fishing, so where it actually exists in that sense. But on the other hand, if the mercury levels are really high, even if people are doing it, does it actually exist?
Right. So then it's not an existing use per hour. So the thing to not fall into the trap of, and we hear this confusion a lot, is that existing uses as a term of art in the Water Quality Standards Program is different from does the use exist. So clearly the use exists in this scenario because people are fishing at subsistence levels. But from our program, federal program level of term of art existing uses, it's technically not an existing use. I don't know if that helps some people, but so in that situation, because people are actually using the water in that way, then the conversation turns to what do we need to do to actually attain that use, and can it be attained in any way at all?
Okay,
I guess I had a question.
Oh, okay.
Related to that was because I was thinking about designation of subsistence fishing, for example, and I asked a comment to say when you designate the new beneficial use, you must also add the water quality criteria to be associated with that use. That's kind of what I heard.
For a complete water quality standard, if you're submitting for standards approval, right?
So is that really the case? So if a region is going to add a subsistence fishing use, we would have to designate every water quality criteria to go along with every pollutant that could be found in fish. So we need to send you like 120 combinations of the safe level to eat for mercury, PCBs, arsenic, everything.
I think so. That's what, often we'll get, most of the tribes send us new water quality standards that they need approved, and they will submit us the use and all the criteria that protect the use. Unless you can make a case where you don't need all those criteria.
A way to think about it, and if I was like the annoying teacher, it'd be like, well, if you are designating a water to be used for subsistence fishing, how would you protect that water or ensure that water can achieve subsistence fishing if you haven't identified what the criteria would need to be to support safe subsistence fishing? So you would need to recalculate your normal criteria to account for the increased amount of fish that's being eaten for each of those pollutants.
Did Washington State do something like that recently? So where they came up with a bigger fish consumption number, they had to change all their human health criteria.
For California, in terms of what Port Cologne requires of us, the Water Code doesn't expressly link the designation of uses with the development of water quality objectives to establish, to reasonably protect the use. So I'm interested in hearing EPA's perspective on this. Our practice also doesn't comport with that. Recently, of course, we developed the new definitions for tribal and subsistence fishing, and there's 3 related new beneficial use definitions. And our thought process was let's first get the actual definitions on the books. We do have some water quality objectives pertaining to mercury to expressly protect those new uses, but there are other objectives that we've not evaluated that would also protect the different activities that fall under the uses. And our thought process was, well, let's get the use on the books, let's get the designations occurring, and as we can, then let's develop the water quality objectives to protect those different activities with respect to the multitude of pollutants.
So in the scenario, in your situation, have you already assigned one of those 3 new objectives to specific waters? Or you've just sort of put the uses on the books as potentially available for you to eventually assign them to certain waters?
A mix of that. We developed uses. We established objectives that directly link to the use. And so once the use is designated to a water body, that objective would automatically link. And then there are other objectives that aren't yet developed.
Right. Okay, so So let me clarify one thing. Thank you, that was actually very helpful. So let me clarify one thing. So when EPA acts, and Terry and Matt feel free to jump in, when we act on what is new or revised. We don't act on what is missing. So if you choose to create a subsistence fishing use, and you've been able to identify 2 of the parameters for which you know what the right, and when you say objective, that's your criteria, right? Yeah. So you can identify that for at least 2 of the parameters, you know what the criteria needs to be in order to be able to protect for the tribes eating at that high consumption rate. EPA will go and we can approve those too. We wouldn't disapprove because you didn't adopt criteria for the other 80 some or whatever parameters there are. We would certainly work with the state to figure out how to get those other ones on the books, because you're not going to be fully protecting the tribal community until you've done them all. But that's not an approval-disapproval situation. That's just a timing-based, doing what you can when you can do it. It's all about incremental progress. So that's actually, I'm glad you pointed that out. So I didn't want to leave you all with that implication.
Okay. Right.
That probably sounded really
one
scary.
More. Yeah,
Sorry.
Last question.
I was listening to the lady's question in the back about changing the uses. And I remember you asking us a knowledge check question on slide 45. And just correct me if I misunderstood. I thought that if, Peachy State wants to change its swimming use to boating, then a use attainment analysis rating is required.
Mm-hmm. From swimming to boating, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think she mentioned, can I change a use? And I thought you may have told her no.
Existing.
That was that an existing use question, I think.
Okay.
You can't remove the existing use, but if they wanted to change a swimming use for a boating use, and they didn't have, and the swimming use wasn't existing, and they determined in the UAA that swimming wasn't existing, they can do a UAA for that.
As long as it's not existing.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much, Matt. I'm going to cut it off there. Round of applause for Matt.